In 16th century Europe, where castles stood as stone sentinels over a landscape torn by endless wars, deep-rooted superstitions, and the oppressive weight of feudal hierarchies, few figures cast as dark, fascinating, and disturbing a shadow as Elizabeth Báthory, known to posterity as the Blood Countess. Her life, a tapestry woven with threads of boundless privilege, unbridled ambition, and accusations of cruelty that border on the inconceivable, seems torn from the most twisted nightmares of a Gothic chronicler, yet it is rooted in a reality as complex as it is unsettling. Elizabeth, or Ursabet, as she was called in her native Hungary, was not a fictional villain from a macabre tale but a flesh-and-blood woman, a Hungarian noble whose existence was transformed by rumors, envy, and the political and religious tensions of her time into a symbol of eternal horror. Her story, intertwining palace intrigue, alleged sadism, and a touch of dark humor to make the indigestible bearable, plunges us into an era where power was a deadly game, loyalties shifted as swiftly as the wind, and truth often vanished under the overwhelming weight of legends. Born on August 7, 1560, in Nyírbátor, a town in the heart of the Kingdom of Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory entered the world as a scion of one of Eastern Europe's most powerful dynasties. The Báthorys were not mere provincial nobles. Their influence spread like a web across Hungary, Transylvania, and Poland, with connections reaching the continent's most prominent courts. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, was a political titan, not only a Hungarian noble of impeccable lineage but also King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, a man whose authority echoed from the marble halls of Krakow to the stone fortresses of Vilnius, where treaties were signed with the same solemnity as masses. Her cousins, like Sigismund and Christopher Báthory, ruled Transylvania, a strategic region serving as a bulwark against the Ottomans, whose incursions kept Eastern Europe in a state of perpetual alert. Raised in the castle of Ext, a somber fortress surrounded by misty swamps and dense forests in northeastern Hungary, Elizabeth grew up in a world of almost surreal opulence. Halls adorned with Flemish tapestries woven with gold and silver threads, where scenes of hunts, mythical battles, and pagan gods came alive under the flickering light of torches. Tables laden with exotic delicacies like roasted venison with wild herbs, pheasants stuffed with chestnuts and walnuts, peacocks served with their iridescent feathers as trophies, and spiced wines imported from Bordeaux, Tuscany, or even the distant Levant, where merchants traded cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg for gold, and servants who bowed at her every gesture with a mix of fear and reverence, knowing a single misstep could mean severe punishment, from public flogging to banishment to a remote village. Elizabeth's education was a rare luxury for a woman of her time, reflecting her family's status and ambitions. She mastered Latin, German, and Hungarian, languages that allowed her to read classical texts like the works of Virgil, Ovid, and Seneca, whose tales of gods, heroes, and tragedies fueled her imagination. She studied theological treatises circulating among Protestant courts, defending Calvin's ideas against the dominant Catholicism, and she deciphered diplomatic letters from Vienna, Krakow, or Istanbul, where alliances were woven with veiled promises and threats. She also learned basic mathematics, not for abstract equations but to manage the family estates, calculate taxes collected in grain or livestock, and anticipate the needs of castles during war or famine. Her mother, Anna Báthory, a woman of stern character, piercing gaze, and unyielding will, personally oversaw her education, ensuring Elizabeth was not only learned but also versed in the subtleties of courtly etiquette. How to bow to a prince without seeming servile, how to write letters with the elegance needed to impress allies, how to host a banquet that left guests talking of its magnificence for months. Her father, George Báthory, a man immersed in the intrigues of the Hungarian court, taught her the importance of strategic alliances, showing her how a well-planned marriage, a timely favor, or a carefully calibrated threat could secure a family's power for generations. From an early age, Elizabeth understood that power was not merely inherited through a name but maintained through cunning, intimidation, and, at times, cruelty, a lesson she would apply with almost surgical precision in the years to come. From childhood, Elizabeth displayed keen intelligence, an indomitable spirit, and a presence that commanded fare. Chronicles, though sparse on details of her early years, describe her as a young woman of almost supernatural beauty, with pale skin that seemed to reflect moonlight, jet black hair cascading to her waist, framing a face with high cheekbones, full lips, and a straight nose that lent her an air of classical nobility, and eyes that, according to some, held an unsettling gleam. as if they could unravel the deepest secrets of those who met her gaze. Her beauty was both a gift and a tool, a currency in a world where appearance signified virtue, power, and divine favor. But not everything was perfect about the young Báthory. Rumors, later amplified by her detractors, suggested she suffered from uncontrollable fits of rage or seizures, which some attributed to epilepsy, others to a volcanic temperament, and the most superstitious to demonic possession or a curse inherited from some dark branch of her lineage. These stories, likely exaggerated or invented by enemies eager to discredit her, fit perfectly with an era obsessed with the supernatural, where any unusual behavior could be interpreted as a sign of the devil, an ill omen, or proof of witchcraft. There is no solid evidence that Elizabeth was any different from other noblewomen of her time, raised in a world where strict discipline, rigid expectations, and the pressure to uphold family honor shaped both body and mind. Yet these early rumors laid the foundation for the narrative that, decades later, would transform her into a monster. Life at Ext Castle was not just a parade of luxury and privilege, it was also a training ground for the complexities of feudal power. As the daughter of George and Anna Báthory, Elizabeth was schooled in the arts of politics and diplomacy, learning to read the hidden intentions behind courtly smiles, negotiate with local nobles coveting her family's lands, and maintain control over the peasants who worked the wheat, barley, rye, and oat fields that sustained the Báthory wealth. Her mother taught her the art of estate management, from overseeing harvests and ensuring granaries were full to collecting taxes in grain, livestock, wool, or manual labor, a task requiring both mathematical precision and a firm hand to prevent rebellions among peasants living in wooden and mud huts, often on the brink of starvation. Her father showed her how to navigate the treacherous waters of the Hungarian court, where alliances could break with a misspoken word, an accidental insult, or a discovered betrayal, and enemies lurked behind every flowery compliment. Stories from her childhood include anecdotes of harsh punishments for disobedient or negligent servants, public floggings in the castle courtyard, where screams echoed against stone walls, days of fasting imposed as penance, leaving offenders weak and hungry, or, in extreme cases, banishment to remote villages, where exiles had to survive without the castle's protection. These practices, though brutal by modern standards, were common in the feudal world, where nobles held near absolute power over their subjects, and punishments served both to maintain discipline and reinforce the social hierarchy. However, these anecdotes, possibly exaggerated by later chroniclers eager to paint a portrait of a young woman already destined for evil, would fuel the legend of her cruelty. At age 15, in 1575, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian noble 10 years her senior, known as the Black Hero for his ferocity in wars against the Ottomans. The marriage, as was customary among the nobility, was not a romance born of passion but a strategic alliance designed to strengthen ties between two powerful families. The Nadasdys, though not as illustrious as the Báthorys, controlled vast lands in western Hungary and had a military reputation that made them indispensable in the fight against the Turks, whose incursions kept Eastern Europe in constant tension. The wedding, held at Vranov Castle, was a spectacle of ostentation reflecting the wealth and power of both families. Banquets lasting days, with tables laden with roasted peacocks, their iridescent colors a symbol of luxury, whole boars cooked in exotic spices from Constantinople, cakes decorated with sugar imported from Venice, and crystal goblets filled with spiced wines laced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Musicians playing lyres, lutes, trumpets, and drums, filling the air with melodies that echoed in stone halls as guests danced under the light of iron chandeliers, and gifts including jewel-encrusted rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, Arabian horses with gold-threaded saddles, scrolls granting lands and titles, and chests filled with gold and silver coins symbolizing the union of two fortunes. Ferenc, a robust man with a sun-weathered face, thick beard, and a gaze more suited to war than courtly life, received Countess Castle as part of the arrangement, a somber fortress perched on a hill surrounded by dense forests and peasant villages in what is now Slovakia. This place, with its gray stone walls, towers that seemed to watch the horizon with suspicion, cold corridors lit by flickering torches, and near-tangible darkness of its underground dungeons, would become the epicenter of Elizabeth's infamy. Elizabeth's life as Ferenc's wife was not simple, though not unusual for a noblewoman of her rank. Ferenc spent long periods away, leading military campaigns against the Ottomans on the kingdom's eastern borders, negotiating alliances at the Hungarian king's court, or overseeing fortifications in remote lands like the Transylvanian plains or Carpathian mountain passes. This left Elizabeth, still a teenager in the early years of her marriage, in charge of managing the family's vast estates, including not only Čachtice but also lesser castles like Sarver, Bekov, and Korester, and dozens of villages scattered across Hungary and Transylvania. Managing these properties required a sharp mind, an iron will, and unquestionable authority. Elizabeth oversaw wheat, barley, rye, and oat crops, ensuring harvests were sufficient to feed servants, soldiers stationed at the castles, and villages under her control, especially in years of drought or floods that could devastate fields. She collected taxes from peasants, often paid in grain, livestock, wool, honey, or manual labor, especially in times of scarcity when money was rare. She resolved disputes among tenants, ranging from fights over land boundaries, grazing rights, or water access to accusations of theft, adultery, or breaches of feudal contracts, and she maintained discipline among servants, who included cooks, maids, seamstresses, laundresses, armed guards, scribes, blacksmiths, carpenters, and stable hands. It was no easy task. Peasants, living in wooden and mud huts often on the brink of starvation, resisted paying taxes, especially in years of poor harvests, and servants, many of them young recruits from nearby villages, could be hard to control, particularly when news of Ottoman wars, peasant rebellions in other regions, or rumors of plagues and famines created a climate of unrest. As lady of the castle, Elizabeth was also responsible for local justice, a role that vested her with near-divine power over her subjects. In an era where nobles held absolute authority, she could dictate punishments for minor offenses like grain theft, disobedience, peasant brawls, or disrespect toward authority, and for graver crimes like treason, murder, heresy, or even suspicions of witchcraft, which in the 16th century could be as simple as possessing strange herbs or muttering words in an unknown tongue. Chronicles from the time suggest Elizabeth was not reluctant to impose harsh punishments. Floggings in the castle courtyard, where the punished screams echoed against stone walls, accompanied by the crack of leather whips. Mutilations like cutting off a hand, ear, or nose for repeat thieves, defiant servants, or peasants refusing taxes, or even public executions by garrote, hanging, or, in extreme cases, beheading, which served as spectacles to reinforce feudal power and deter future transgressions. These practices, though brutal by modern standards, were common in the 16th century, and nobles, both men and women, applied them to maintain control in a world where rebellion, though rare, was always a latent possibility. Stories from the time recount Elizabeth's stern temperament with servants who failed their tasks. A maid who ruined a silk dress by washing it in overly hot water, receiving lashes until she couldn't stand. Or a cook who served cold soup to a noble guest, forced to spend a night in a damp cell with no food or water, with only rats for company. Punishments, which could include floggings with leather whips reinforced with metal tips or days of confinement in dark cells, were seen as a natural extension of her authority. However, these practices, though common, provided fertile ground for the rumors that would later accuse her of extreme sadism. Her marriage to Ferenc was not childless, though children came relatively late, likely due to her husband's prolonged absences on battlefields, diplomatic missions, or distant fortresses. Between 1585 and 1598, Elizabeth gave birth to 4 children: Anna, Orshalia, Catalin, and Pal. Raising these children while managing estates and coping with the solitude of life at Čachtice added another layer of responsibility to her already burdened existence. Letters Elizabeth wrote during this period, some preserved in Hungarian and Slovak archives, reveal a practical, detail-oriented woman deeply engaged in her family's affairs. In a 1590 letter to Ferenc from Čachtice, she requests more provisions for the castle, mentioning the need for grain, livestock, wool, tools, and barrels of beer to sustain servants and soldiers during a particularly harsh winter, when snow blocked roads, rivers froze, and food supplies dwindled. In another letter from 1593, she expresses concern for the education of Anna, her eldest daughter, asking Ferenc to hire a tutor in Latin, music, and dance to prepare her for an advantageous marriage to a Transylvanian or Polish noble, an alliance that could further strengthen the Báthory's position. These letters, written in elegant Hungarian sprinkled with Latin phrases, show an Elizabeth far from isolated or deranged, deeply immersed in the daily details of her role as a feudal lady, mother, and wife of an absent warrior. But life at Čachtice was not just administrative work, feudal justice, and family duties. The castle, with its cold corridors lit by flickering torches, stone chambers echoing with footsteps, narrow windows barely letting in sunlight, and near-tangible darkness of its underground dungeons, could feel oppressive, especially during Hungary's long winters, when snow-covered roads, villages were isolated, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf among the towers. Elizabeth, like many nobles of her time, sought ways to alleviate the tedium of life in a remote castle. She hosted banquets for local nobles, serving exotic delicacies like roasted swan with plum sauce, trout stuffed with fresh herbs, boars cooked in spices from Constantinople, peacocks presented with their feathers as a trophy of opulence, and cakes filled with dried fruits imported from the East, all served on silver trays and paired with spiced wines that warmed the throat. She entertained herself with musicians playing melancholic melodies on lutes, flutes, viols, and clavichords, filling the halls with harmonies evoking both joy and melancholy, and with jongleur narrating tales of medieval heroes like Roland, martyr saints like Saint Stephen, Hungary's first king, or legendary battles against the Turks, keeping guests on the edge of their seats, eyes gleaming under chandelier light. She also took an interest in fashion, importing silk, velvet, and brocade fabrics from Italy and France, where Venetian and Lyonnaise merchants offered textiles so fine they seemed to float like mist. Her wardrobes, according to period inventories, included cloaks embroidered with gold and silver threads, bodices adorned with pearls and gems, skirts so wide they required several maids to put on, and headdresses with ostrich feathers or jewels that shone like stars. Her focus on appearance was not unusual. In an era where beauty symbolized power, virtue, and divine favor, noblewomen spent fortunes on cosmetics, which could include bizarre ingredients like pearl powder, bear fat, beeswax, distilled vinegar, or even white lead, a slow poison that could cause madness, seizures, or premature death but was coveted for its ability to whiten skin and give an ethereal look. Ferenc Nádasdy's death in 1604 marked a turning point in Elizabeth's life. At 44, she became a wealthy and powerful widow, controlling not only Čachtice but several other castles and lands, generating considerable income, enough to rival some European princes. Without a husband to legitimize her authority, Elizabeth faced a world where women, even of her status, were viewed with suspicion if they acted too independently. Her position was enviable but dangerous. As a widow, she was an easy target for nobles coveting her lands, royal creditors seeing her wealth as a solution to the crown's debts, and political rivals resenting her influence and Protestant faith in a kingdom increasingly dominated by Catholicism. It was in this context that rumors of her crimes began to take shape, fueled by a mix of envy, fear, and the era's political and religious tensions. Hungary at the turn of the century was a cauldron of conflicts. Wars against the Ottomans, constantly threatening the kingdom's borders, kept nobles in a state of perpetual alert, with fortresses like Čachtice serving as key defense points for Christian territory. Turkish raids, which could devastate entire villages in a single night, left trails of death and ashes, and nobles like Ferenc Nádasdy were essential to keeping borders secure. At the same time, religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants divided the Hungarian nobility. The Báthorys, as Calvinist Protestants, were a powerful minority in a kingdom where Catholicism, backed by the Habsburg dynasty, was gaining ground under King Matthias II. Elizabeth, with her Protestant faith, wealth, and independence, was a figure who inspired both admiration and resentment. Her cousin, George Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, was a Catholic loyal to the king, with considerable power to influence the kingdom's affairs. Moreover, Elizabeth had lent money to the king on several occasions, significant sums that funded wars against the Ottomans but also made her an inconvenient creditor to an indebted crown. These political and religious dynamics provided the backdrop for the accusations that would transform her into a monster, as her enemies had both personal and political motives to neutralize her. Rumors of Elizabeth's crimes began circulating around 1609, when complaints about the disappearance of young peasant girls around Čachtice grew more frequent. According to the stories, Elizabeth was obsessed with preserving her youth and beauty, a desire, though common among the nobility, she took to unimaginable extremes. The most persistent legend, which would become the hallmark of her infamy, claims she discovered, perhaps by accident, that the blood of young virgins rejuvenated her skin. The story, appearing in later chronicles but not in trial records, recounts that after striking a servant in a fit of rage and noticing that the blood splattered on her hand left her skin softer, brighter, and smoother, Elizabeth embarked on a macabre crusade to collect blood, bathing in it as if it were an elixir of eternal youth. This image, of a countess submerged in an iron tub filled with blood, surrounded by flickering candles, the air heavy with the metallic scent of death, and her accomplices working silently in the shadows, is as iconic as it is improbable but perfectly suited an era that associated blood with life, vitality, and, in some circles, dark magic. In the 16th century, blood was not just a bodily fluid. It was a mystical symbol, a key component in alchemical and medical remedies promising to cure diseases, restore youth, or even grant supernatural powers. Physicians of the time prescribed animal blood for anemia or weakness, and alchemists believed human blood held mystical properties, capable of linking body and soul. To obtain this blood, Elizabeth and a small group of accomplices allegedly lured young peasant girls to the castle with promises of work as maids, cooks, seamstresses, laundresses, or attendants. These promises were irresistible bait in a region where poverty was endemic. Peasant families lived in thatched-roof mud huts, and service to a noble offered hope of a better life, albeit at the cost of grueling labor. Some versions of the story suggest Elizabeth also offered education to daughters of minor nobility, promising to teach them etiquette, languages like Latin or German, music, and dance, skills that could improve their marriage prospects and elevate their family's status. These promises were particularly appealing to lesser nobles, who often lacked the resources to educate their daughters in the courts of Vienna or Krakow. Once inside cactus walls, the victims were subjected to tortures that defy imagination. Beaten with leather whips reinforced with metal tips, leaving skin torn and bleeding, burned with red-hot irons, marking flesh with a chilling hiss, cut with scissors or sharp knives to extract blood for supposed rituals, pricked with long needles until they bled out, often tied to posts or hung from chains in the dungeons, or left to starve in damp, dark cells, where rats gnawed at their clothes and mold covered the walls. Some accounts, particularly from trial witnesses, claimed Elizabeth actively participated in these tortures, reveling in her victims suffering with a chilling coldness. It was said she bit their flesh, tearing off pieces with her teeth like a wild animal, drank their blood directly from wounds, or forced them to perform humiliating tasks, like cleaning the castle floors naked, dancing until exhaustion, or reciting prayers while being beaten. Her accomplices: Anna Darvulia, a woman described as a witch with knowledge of herbs, poisons, and spells, whose wrinkled face and sunken eyes inspired terror; Dorothea Sentes, a robust, loyal servant with fearsome physical strength; Ilona Joe, another trusted maid who handled the darkest tasks with chilling efficiency; and Fixco, a deformed young servant who served as her trusted man, carrying bodies and cleaning up evidence, were essential to this alleged reign of terror. The details of the tortures, according to trial testimonies, are so grotesque they seem lifted from a medieval grimoire penned by a deranged monk. One servant, a witness claimed, was tied to a post in the castle courtyard and whipped until her body was a mass of bruises and blood, only to be burned with candles while Elizabeth watched from an ornate chair, a goblet of wine in hand and a smile some described as demonic. Another was forced to run naked through the courtyard in the dead of winter, doused with buckets of icy water until she died of hypothermia, her frozen body found at dawn covered in frost, eyes open in an expression of eternal terror. Some accounts claim Elizabeth used specific instruments, like pincers to tear flesh, long needles to pierce skin to the bone, sewing scissors to cut fingers, ears, or lips, or even a device known as the Iron Maiden, a spiked sarcophagus that, though likely apocryphal, appears in later chronicles as a symbol of her cruelty. Other witnesses spoke of dismembered bodies thrown into mass graves in nearby forests, burned in makeshift pyres to hide evidence, or even fed to the castle's pigs, which devoured the remains with horrifying voracity. One of the most chilling stories describes Elizabeth sewing a talkative servant's lips shut with thick thread and a bone needle, as the girl screamed in pain and blood dripped onto the stone floor. These images, though possibly exaggerated by tortured witnesses, capture the cruelty attributed to the Countess and fueled her transformation into an icon of horror. The number of victims is one of the most controversial aspects of the story. Trial documents from January to February 1611 mention between 36 and 80 murders, based on testimonies from servants and witnesses, many obtained under torture, a practice not exactly known for producing reliable truths. Witnesses, faced with the prospect of being burned alive, mutilated, or hanged, would have said anything to save themselves, and their accounts are riddled with contradictions. Some spoke of dozens of bodies buried in the castle, others of hundreds, and some even claimed the murders extended to other castles under Elizabeth's control. In 1729, Jesuit priest Laszlo Tarazzi inflated the figure to over 600, a number so astronomical it seems more sensationalist invention than plausible fact. To put it in perspective, murdering 600 people in a rural region without authorities, victims' families, or local nobles noticing for years would have required near impossible logistics, even for a noble with Elizabeth's power and resources. The villages around Čachtice were small, with populations of a few hundred, and mass disappearances would have caused an uproar much earlier, especially if, as some accounts claim, Elizabeth began abducting daughters of minor nobility, whose families had more resources and connections to demand justice. The exaggeration of these figures likely served to justify the authorities' intervention, further demonize Elizabeth, and feed the fears of a society obsessed with sin, the devil, and witchcraft. The political and social context of the time adds layers of complexity to the story. Hungary was in constant tension, not only from wars against the Ottomans, which kept nobles on perpetual alert, but from internal struggles between Catholics and Protestants. The Báthorys, as Calvinist Protestants, were a powerful minority in a kingdom where Catholicism, backed by the Habsburg dynasty, was gaining ground under King Matthias II. Elizabeth, with her Protestant faith, wealth, and independence, was a figure who inspired both admiration and resentment. Her cousin, George Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, was a Catholic loyal to the king, with considerable power to influence the kingdom's affairs. Moreover, Elizabeth had lent money to the king on several occasions, significant sums that funded wars against the Ottomans but also made her an inconvenient creditor to an indebted crown. These political and religious dynamics provided the backdrop for the accusations that would transform her into a monster, as her enemies had both personal and political motives to neutralize her. Thurzo, in particular, stood to benefit from the confiscation of Elizabeth's lands, which would pass to the crown or its allies, and the cancellation of the king's debts to her. The investigation against Elizabeth began in earnest in 1610, when complaints about disappearances around Čachtice became too numerous to ignore. George Thurzo, acting under King Matthias II's orders, organized a network of informants to gather evidence, including local priests, peasants, merchants, and minor nobles who had heard rumors about the castle's activities. Rumors already circulated among peasants, who whispered of girls who entered Čachtice to work and never returned to their villages, of screams heard from the castle on moonless nights, of carts leaving at dawn carrying suspicious bundles wrapped in cloth, and of fires burning in nearby forests, leaving a smell of charred flesh lingering for days. Some villagers claimed to have seen shadows moving in the castle's high windows, figures seeming to watch from the towers, while others told tales of dogs returning from the woods with human bones in their mouths. Stories that, though likely exaggerated, fueled collective fear. In December 1610, Thurzo, accompanied by soldiers armed with halberds, swords, and torches, stormed Čachtice Castle in an operation that felt more like a military assault than a judicial investigation. According to official reports, what they found was a scene of horror: mutilated bodies in the dungeons, girls chained with fresh wounds, pools of dried blood on stone floors, torture tools like whips, knives, and pincers scattered in a locked secret chamber, and a stench of death permeating the air. A dying servant, found with deep cuts and burns across her body, was cited as key evidence, though details of these discoveries vary by source. Some modern historians, like Kimberly Craft, argue these accounts were embellished to justify Thurzo's intervention, who needed a strong case to condemn a noble of Elizabeth's stature without sparking a revolt from her still powerful family allies in Transylvania, Poland, and Protestant European courts. The trial that followed, from January to February 1611, was more a political spectacle than an impartial judicial process. Over 300 witnesses, many of them servants tortured with hot irons, thumbscrews, or whips, or peasants intimidated by armed soldiers, testified against Elizabeth and her accomplices. Testimonies described scenes of sadism seemingly drawn from a medieval torture manual. Naked girls whipped to death, their skin hanging in tatters. Bodies burned with candles until flesh melted, leaving black, smoking marks. Fingers, ears, and noses cut off with scissors, leaving pools of blood on the floor. Faces disfigured with knives until victims were unrecognizable. And nocturnal rituals where Elizabeth supposedly invoked dark powers, accompanied by Anna Darvulia, who, witnesses claimed, recited incantations in an unknown tongue as victims screamed in pain. Some witnesses claimed to have seen Elizabeth laugh as her victims begged for mercy, her laughter echoing through the castle's halls like an infernal echo, while others spoke of macabre banquets where the Countess served meat of dubious origin, paired with red wine some swore tasted metallic, an accusation likely invented to fuel fears of cannibalism. Anna Darvulia, the alleged witch and one of Elizabeth's main accomplices, had died years earlier, possibly of natural causes like a fever or lung disease, sparing her from facing justice. But Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Joe, and Fixco were not so fortunate. The three were tried alongside Elizabeth, and their tortured testimonies painted a picture of depravity that shocked even the judges, who, accustomed to the era's violence, were not easily impressed. The punishments for Elizabeth's accomplices were as brutal as the crimes attributed to them. Dorothea Sentes and Ilona Joe were beheaded with a sword in a public square in Čachtice, before a crowd of peasants and nobles shouting insults, throwing stones, and spitting on the bodies. Their heads were displayed on pikes for a full day as a warning to anyone contemplating defying the king's authority, before their bodies were burned in pyres and their ashes scattered in a nearby river to leave no trace, a ritual symbolizing the purification of evil. Fixco, deemed less culpable for acting under orders, suffered an equally cruel fate. His fingers were cut off one by one with red-hot pincers as the crowd watched in horrified silence, broken only by his screams of agony, before he was thrown alive into the fire, his cries resonating until the flames consumed him entirely. These punishments were not just justice but a clear message. No one, not even a noble's servants, would escape the king's reach. Elizabeth, however, avoided execution. Her noble status and family connections made a public death politically risky. The Báthorys still had powerful allies in Transylvania, Poland, and Protestant European courts, and an execution could have sparked a rebellion or diplomatic conflict with unpredictable consequences. Instead, she was sentenced to a fate equally cruel in many ways: perpetual confinement. Elizabeth was walled up in a room in her own Cactus Castle, a cold stone cell with no windows, only a small slit in the wall for passing food and water. Chronicles describe her prison as a narrow space, barely large enough for a straw bed, a rough wooden table, and a rickety chair, lit only by the dim light filtering through the slit, where the air smelled of mold and dampness. There she lived in total isolation, deprived of all human contact except for the servants who brought provisions, who, according to rumors, avoided her gaze for fear of her supposed evil or a curse that might befall them. Stories tell of Elizabeth, a woman accustomed to the luxuries of banquets, silk dresses, glittering jewels, and absolute power, sinking into despair, writing unanswered letters to her children, muttering Latin prayers in the dark, reciting verses from Calvinist psalms learned in her youth, and, in her worst moments, scratching the stone walls with her nails until they bled, leaving marks guards said resembled demonic scribbles. She died on August 21, 1614, at 54, likely of natural causes like an infection, heart failure, or the weakening caused by years of confinement. However, some rumors, fueled by local folklore, suggest she starved herself, unable to bear the weight of her imprisonment, the loss of her power, and the betrayal of a world that had condemned her. Elizabeth's death did not end her story. Rather, it marked the beginning of her transformation into a myth. In the 17th century, Europe was fascinated by tales of vampires, witches, and supernatural creatures, and a countess who supposedly bathed in blood fit perfectly into that imaginary. Jesuits, eager to reinforce Catholic morality and demonize Protestants, amplified tales of her crimes, adding sensationalist details absent from original documents. Laszlo Tarazzi's 1729 account was particularly influential. the first to mention bloodbaths, an image that seared itself into the popular imagination as a symbol of absolute depravity. By the 19th century, Elizabeth had become a figure of Gothic literature, inspiring vampire stories alongside figures like Vlad the Impaler, whose own legend of cruelty fueled the Dracula myth. Novels, poems, and engravings of the era portrayed her as a supernatural femme fatale, with burning eyes, a deathly pale face, and a cruel smile, bathing in blood as the devil whispered in her ear or wolves howled in the surrounding forests. The stories grew more elaborate over time. Some claim she made a pact with the devil to preserve her youth, others that she used blood not only to bathe but to craft alchemical potions granting supernatural strength, and others that she kept a harem of kidnapped girls in her dungeons, torturing them for pleasure before sacrificing them in pagan rituals. Modern historians have tried to separate truth from fiction, but the task is daunting. Authors like Laszlo Nagy and Tony Thorne suggest Elizabeth may have been a victim of a political conspiracy orchestrated by her rivals. Her wealth, independence, and Protestant faith made her an ideal target for King Matthias II and George Thurzo, who benefited from the confiscation of her lands and the cancellation of the crown's debts to her. Testimonies obtained under torture are unreliable, as servants faced with burning, mutilation, or hanging would have said anything to save themselves, even inventing tales of mass murders, satanic rituals, or bloodbaths. The lack of documented complaints before 1610 raises doubts about the scale of her crimes. If Elizabeth had been killing dozens or hundreds of girls for years, local nobles, victims' families, or village priests likely would have alerted authorities much earlier. Some historians, like Kimberly Craft, argue Elizabeth may have been cruel to her servants, a practice not unusual among the nobility, but that her punishments were exaggerated by enemies to make her a scapegoat. Others, like Lyle, suggest accusations of vampirism and witchcraft were a way to channel the fears of a society that viewed powerful women as a threat to the established order, especially in an era when witch hunts were rampant across Europe. The cultural context also plays a crucial role in constructing Elizabeth's legend. In the 16th century, powerful women were viewed with suspicion, especially if, like Elizabeth, they defied gender norms by exerting absolute control over their lands, subjects, and finances. Accusations of witchcraft, vampirism, or unnatural behavior were common tools to discredit such women, from queens like Anne Boleyn in England to minor nobles daring to challenge their superiors in local courts. Elizabeth's obsession with beauty, if it existed, was not unique. Cosmetics of the time included bizarre ingredients like pearl powder, bear fat, beeswax, distilled vinegar, ground sulfur, or even white lead, a slow poison that could cause madness, seizures, hair loss, or premature death but was coveted for its ability to whiten skin and give an ethereal, almost angelic look. Blood, as a symbol of life and vitality, was not a far-fetched idea in a world where medicine blended with alchemy and superstition. Physicians prescribed animal blood, like that of pigeons or lambs, for anemia, weakness, or melancholy, and alchemists believed human blood held mystical properties, capable of linking body and soul or serving as an ingredient in potions for eternal youth. Blood baths, however, do not appear in trial records, suggesting they were a later addition, possibly inspired by Eastern European vampire rumors, where tales of Strigoi, blood-drinking creatures stalking the night, were part of peasant folklore told around village fires. Archaeology has tried to shed light on the truth, but results are ambiguous. Excavations at Cactus Castle in the 20th and early 21st centuries have uncovered dungeons, tunnels, and underground chambers, some with rusted chains, shackles embedded in walls, remains of tools that could have been used for torture, like notched knives, pincers, and hooks, and human bone fragments that have puzzled researchers. However, there is no conclusive evidence of mass murders. Human remains found around the castle could be from Ottoman war victims, which left thousands dead in the region, common executions ordered by nobles, servants who died of diseases like the bubonic plague or tuberculosis, or even Christian burials in forgotten cemeteries. The lack of contemporary records of mass disappearances before 1610 supports the idea that rumors may have been amplified for political reasons, possibly by Thurzo and his allies, who needed justification to intervene in a noblewoman's domains and seize her lands. Elizabeth Báthory's life, then, is a puzzle with no definitive solution. Was she a psychopath who tortured and murdered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young women in a frenzy of sadism and obsession with beauty? A cruel noble whose punishments, common for her time, were exaggerated into monstrosity by a society that feared her power? Or a victim of a political witch hunt, designed to strip her of wealth, lands, and influence in a world that punished female independence? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but centuries have buried the evidence under layers of myth, exaggeration, and propaganda. What is certain is that her story has captured imaginations for over 400 years, from Jesuit chronicles that demonized her, written with pens dipped in ink and prejudice, to 19th-century Gothic novels with their haunted castles and fatal women, 1970s B-horror films, where actresses in black capes and pale makeup played a bloodthirsty Elizabeth, and modern series portraying her as a charismatic villain with impeccable wardrobe, a cold laugh, and a thirst for power as great as her thirst for blood. In life, Elizabeth was a flesh-and-blood woman with ambitions, flaws, and perhaps a darkness we'll never fully understand. She was a mother who wrote letters worrying about her children's education, urging them to study diligently and honor the Báthory name. An administrator who kept her lands in order during wartime, ensuring granaries were full and soldiers well fed. A noble who navigated Hungary's treacherous political waters with a mix of cunning, boldness, and pragmatism, lending money to the king and negotiating with allies and enemies alike. But she was also a woman trapped in a world that punished female independence, that saw beauty as a double-edged weapon capable of opening doors and sealing fates, and that was ready to turn a person into a symbol to satisfy its own fears, ambitions, and prejudices. In death, Elizabeth became something larger and more terrifying. An icon of horror, a vampiric countess embodying our deepest fears about human cruelty, the obsession with immortality, and the cost of absolute power. Her legacy is a reminder of how power, envy, and superstition can transform a person into a myth, and how truth is often less important than the story we choose to tell. And while today we may laugh at the idea of bathing in blood to stay young, an image so absurd it seems drawn from a bad dream, Elizabeth Báthory's figure continues to challenge us to look in the mirror and ask, how far are we willing to go for beauty, power, or eternity? For the Blood Countess, the answer, real or invented, was always too far.